Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Jim Duff, the Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual platform for today's conversation with Dr. Richard Haass, who is part of our ongoing Civics and American Democracy series. Dr. Richard Haass is the President Emeritus of the Council of Foreign Relations after having served as CFR's president for 20 years. He is also senior counselor with Centerview Partners, an international investment banking advisory firm. In 2013, he chaired the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was the Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass also served as the U.S. coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Dr. Haass has extensive additional government experience. From 1989 to 1993, he was special assistant to President George H.W. Bush and senior director for Near East and South Asian affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1991, Dr. Haass was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions to the development and articulation of U.S. policy during operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Previously, he served in the Departments of State and Defense Department and was a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a master's and doctor of philosophy degrees from Oxford University. He has also received numerous honorary degrees and was a member of the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and Hamilton College. Dr. Haass is the author and editor of 14 books on American foreign policy, 1 book on management, and 1 on American democracy. His latest book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, was published by Penguin Press in January 2023, this year. It became a New York Times bestseller. In it, he discusses the importance of civics and civic education, a cause near and dear to the Society's efforts and mission. We're going to be taking questions today after Dr. Haass and I have a discussion, and you can share your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom window. Dr. Haass, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I apologize for being a bit late, and I think I apologize for not being a lawyer.
No apologies needed in either case. We're just delighted you're with us, and I look forward to our discussion.
Call me Richard, please. The doctor's a little bit too formal.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Let's begin with your inspiration to write the Bill of Obligations. It's a very thought-provoking book. You articulate clearly the polarization we're experiencing in our country and some of the extreme positions held by some in both major political parties. Was this the motivating factor in writing the book, and what were the factors that motivated you to write the book?
Look, I've written a lot of books, and sometimes when you set out to write a book, you've got a plan and you think about it. This is a book that more occurred to me, and what triggered it is I heard myself answering the question, "What keeps you up at night?" And people assumed it was something like China, or if they were asking the question this week, it would be Iran or Hamas or Russia, what have you, or climate change. And I noticed that my answer increasingly was, yeah, those are all big things to worry about, but the real question is whether we're going to have the focus and the bandwidth and the consistency and unity as a country to deal with them. So increasingly, I started worrying that what was going on here domestically was actually the biggest national security challenge facing the United States. So that's essentially how I got here, that at a minimum, our divisions wouldn't let us meet our domestic challenges. That's not new, but it's gotten worse. And worse yet, we'd be literally and figuratively fighting with one another. So we would not only be unable to come together, what would be going on here would be truly dysfunctional, and democracy itself would be at risk. It would set back the cause of democracy around the world if the world's greatest democracy showed how hard it was to operate. So it's what essentially led me. I'm a paid, card carrying foreign policy guy. It's what got me to where I am.
And do you see differences in where we are today than historically? You're a bit of a historian as well, and
Sure.
and we've gone through periods of polarization in the country and deep divisions. But is this exceptional, unusual, or is this sporadic or part of a something you could map
That's a good
periodically?
question. It's an important question, because if it's, we often tend to slightly romanticize the past, and say, well, in the good old days. Well, okay, so there were things historically that were problematic. And obviously in the middle of the 19th century, we had a civil war. So let's put that aside. But I do think what's going on now is qualitatively different. I grew up in the 60s, came of age politically in the 60s. And I think about the 60s with the assassinations, the turmoil domestically, with the Vietnam protests and so on. But those, to me, were, as awful as those things were, particularly the assassinations, they weren't threats to the system. These all operated within, if you will, as misguided as they were, within the democratic reality of the United States. I think what's different now is two things. One is the difficulties of making the government work have grown. And that's dangerous, because when governments can't deliver, then people turn away from traditional politics. And what's ironic is it's often populism that makes it hard for governments to deliver. But then their inability to deliver feeds more populism. But I think that's the cycle we're in now. And that worries me, the degree and depth of difficulty we have. And then secondly, people essentially questioning democracy, its value. There's recent polls talking about 1 out of every 5 Americans feels that violence is now politically motivated violence is justified. You have people don't seeing the value of democracy, intrigued by other systems. So yeah, I think we've got a crisis in American democracy that is qualitatively different than something we've seen, whether it was the 60s or during the Depression. Again, and the Civil War was a different type of crisis in American democracy, built along more than anything, a fault line about slavery, its existence, and its extension to new states in the Union. But this is much more disparate, and it's as a result, it's even more complicated, I would argue, than anything we've seen historically.
I share the concern, Richard, and I do see a difference in the gears of government sort of grinding to a halt. I mean, the founders had devised a system in which and all 3 gears are working as they should and functioning as they should. The system as a whole works, but the gears of government seem to be grinding. And I think you've put your finger on some of the key sources. What I also found inspiring in your analysis of it was your focus on civic education as a solution, and I'll ask you beyond civic education too, what you might see, but we do want to focus as much as we can today and the time that we have on civic education. And do you see a correlation between the polarization we're experiencing and the decline in civic education?
Short answer is yes. The lesson I take is that we shouldn't take democracy for granted. People don't emerge with democracy in their DNA. Democracy has to be seen, it has to be learned, it has to be experienced. And I believe we have failed as a society to teach it. I believe older generations have the responsibility to pass it on. We shouldn't assume that somehow, again, it's intuitive. It's not. And civics education is one of the way to do it. We wouldn't think of graduating, or we shouldn't think of graduating someone from high school or college if couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't do basic math, couldn't figure out how to get online. So why would we graduate people from high schools and colleges who don't understand what democracy requires of its citizens, and why that bargain, if you will, why that relationship is of value, and so forth? And we don't. So it shouldn't surprise us that democracy is in some trouble. I'm not saying this is the only reason, but I do think it is a reason. The only thing everyone has to do in this country is be educated up to through the age of 16. Well, civics, as we used to call it in my day, or citizenship, whatever you want to call it, that ought to be a component. And we ought to try to have as much commonality, because it somewhat defeats the purpose if someone in California is learning a different story than someone in Texas, than someone in Florida or New York. So I'd love it to be as common, as national, if you will, as possible. Yeah, I would make a strong case that we need civics in our schools, because I don't think most parents aren't equipped to teach it, and the media is not going to do it in any systematic way. So I'm not saying it's the only place where democratic behaviors can be taught and encouraged, but it's got unique advantages. Classrooms, again, middle schools, high schools, colleges and universities. So yeah, to me, that's one of the, out of all the potential instruments or tools, if you will, to promote democracy, those are on my short list of the most valuable.
And beyond the civic education in the classrooms, both at the high school and college level, would you include things that aren't strictly could be taught in the classroom, but cultural, or is there a normative element in it as well that culturally we need to be passing along to the next generation?
Absolutely. Lots of ways, whether it's public, popular media, television, movies. I'm involved now in a project, a musical, a choral project based on my book, but looking at different art forms to play Hamilton. Probably introduce more Americans to the founders and some of those debates than probably more people have gone to see Hamilton in the last few years than have read the Federalist Papers. So I think there is an important cultural things, and you've got maybe there's certain things that one day we'll want to do on social media. Social media is part of the problem. Maybe social media could also be part of the solution. Maybe if people get, I'm not wild about it, but as you know, there's all sorts of polls suggest that young people get a lot of their information through TikTok. So maybe there's something one would do with that or one of the other social media venues. I think we've got to be flexible and use all the tools. And I just think classrooms are probably the single best tool, because again, it's structured, it's required, it's a common experience for many. But one of the things I try to write about is there's other ways to imbibe, if you will, democracy. We haven't talked about public service yet. That's right. That's another way. So there are things I think we can do.
Well, good. And why do you think we fail? Why do you think it's dropped out of curriculum? I mean, there's a lot of, this focus on STEM learning was needed and is a good thing, but why did we drop civics as a result?
That's one reason. I think STEM, it's a little bit like musical chairs, and you keep putting in certain mandates. And well, we need our young people to learn science or technology. They got to be more competitive. It's more job oriented. And when the music stopped, there wasn't a chair left in many places for civics or democracy. It's not immediately tied in most people's minds to economic success. It's not hard in the same way that STEM is or some other issues are. So it seems a little bit of it's less than a necessity.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people just assume, we one way or another, the ideas are transmitted. I think also in more recent years, in addition to all that, there's a lack of consensus about what should be taught. So even if people were to agree in principle that we ought to be doing more of this, it might be hard in practice to come to something that everybody was prepared to live with. But I think the main thing is that we just assumed it wasn't the problem, and other things, and there weren't advocates for it. I mean, education, like anything else, there's competition for resources. And I
Mhm.
think there were advocates for everything else, just about, but not for this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's hope our polarization doesn't interfere with getting some of these suggestions and obligations that you've identified back into our classrooms. And I hope we can reach some consensus on how these are presented. You've identified 10 obligations, just as we have the original 10 Bill of Rights, as a 10 good habits of citizens. And I'd like to try to cover as many of those as we can in the short time we have today. But if I could pick 4 or 5 to be sure to get to, I'd like to discuss your suggestions to stay open to compromise, remain civil, respect government service, and support the teaching of civics. And with regard to compromise, could you articulate for us how and why that's so important? And then I have an observation or two to maybe add on my own there.
I mean, specifically, I talk about being open to compromise. There may be occasions where it's such a matter of principle that there's no that people would refuse to budge. But my view is you've always got to ask yourself, what's the real alternative? If you can't, you may not want to get half a loaf, but if the alternative is nothing, suddenly half a loaf looks pretty good. And in a democracy with deeply held preferences and policy positions, you're always going to encounter opposition. So I actually think compromise, for the most part, it's in a sense, it's the sauce of getting stuff done in the democratic project. Somewhere along the way, and I can't quite put my finger on it, compromise has become a little bit of a dirty word.
Yeah.
It's seen as unprincipled. It's a sell, and I think in this age of social media and the rest, it's easy to get hammered. Single issue, movements, and can focus on that, and they don't provide any context. Well, you voted for this bill and included money for that. Yeah, but that was probably the only way to get money for what you wanted. That's the way democracy works.
Right.
But it leaves you vulnerable to those who are, if you will, coming at you narrowly. So for a lot of politicians, the safer path is not to compromise. And often, particularly at the federal level, often you can brag about what you've prevented. I see a little bit less of this at the state and local level, because there you've actually got to perform services. Somebody that does have to provide public safety or pick up the garbage and get things done. So I think the closer you are to implementation, there's often a greater willingness to show some compromise. I just really want people to go through the process, because I think the knee-jerk reaction many times, well, I disagree with that. But then I want people to think it through, and whether, again, their purity, their refusal to compromise would actually leave them better off, or maybe, just maybe, they'd be better off if they got some of what they wanted, even if it included some of what they didn't.
Right.
It's not answer for all seasons, but I think it's a process for all seasons to go through.
Right. Very important. And historically, I mean, it's how the country was founded.
Yeah,
And
just no, it's useful to remind people that the Constitution is a bundle of compromises.
exactly.
And the convention was all about compromise. The Bill of Rights you mentioned, the only way we got ratification
Yeah.
was putting in the, so again, so compromise is not a dirty word. We wouldn't have this republic without it. It's just to remind people and to have political figures who are willing to explain it. It's hard. It's
Yeah.
easier. Soundbite compromise doesn't tend to lend itself to sound bites. I get it.
That's exactly right. And as I was reading your book, I triggered some good memories I had about compromises in our history. And when I was the CEO at the museum here in Washington, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson signing into law the civil rights legislation of 1964. And we hosted Lucy Baines Johnson to join us in that celebration. And she told us a great story about it. The civil rights legislation of 1964 was signed into law on July 2nd, 1964. And July 2nd is her birthday. And her father asked her to accompany him to the signing ceremony. She thought it was going to be at the White House, so she didn't mind so much. But when she found out she had to go up to Capitol Hill for the signing, she was a little irritated. It was her 17th birthday, and she had other plans, I think. But in any event, she accompanied her father to the signing ceremony, and then he handed out the pens that, you know, for signing the legislation. And he gave a pen to Senator Everett Dirksen, a Republican as well. Well, they got in the car ride back to the White House, and she said, "Daddy, why did you give a pen to that Republican, Everett Dirksen?" And he said, "Lucy Baines." And she said she knew she was in trouble when he called her Lucy Baines. "Lucy Baines, I had all the Democrat votes. I needed some Republican votes. And Everett Dirksen took a real risk, and he joined us." And, you know, there you have it. It's very important legislation in our history, and it didn't get done without compromise. But
yeah, I mean, we recently had some legislation passed in the gun control realm. And again, it took compromise, and it was more than some people wanted to see done, and was less, quite a lot less than many others wanted to see done. Wasn't perfect, but it was at least something. And that's the only way we're going to get there. And that's true about issue after issue after issue, as I think that what President Johnson essentially told his daughter has the virtue of being true. You've got to get the votes, and you've got to build a majority, or in some cases a super majority, get things done. And there's no way to get from here to there, in my experience, without compromise. And I'd even say where you sometimes can get from here to there without compromise, it may not be healthy. I actually think that the changes that have the most traction and that stick the most to the democracy are those that often involve compromise from across political lines, because that way it gives a stake across a broader chunk of the political spectrum behind the policy. So when you have the inevitable rotations of power, suddenly we don't pull the rug out from under those policies, which reflected a degree of bipartisan or multi-partisan compromise.
right, exactly. I think you do a great job of identifying these elements and 10 habits, as you've called them. The next one I wanted to be sure we covered is remaining civil. And you give some good examples of that in our history and how important it is. And would you care to go over a couple of those with us?
Like the case for civility, I think it's there's a case for doing it, because even if you and I were to disagree on some issue today, being civil does two things. One is it keeps open the possibility we might find common ground, and even if not, well, there's an issue tomorrow. Civility is it's a way to keep relationships alive amidst inevitable disagreement. It doesn't cost anything to be civil. my experience, being uncivil tends to bring people around. Being civil at least holds open the possibility. And I love the story. I think I write about it in the book, is the relationship between Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg on the court. They came from very different judicial, shall we say, philosophies. And more often than not, I haven't done the math, but in the history, but I expect we're on opposite sides of opinions. But I love the fact that they had a relationship and a friendship, and whether it was going to opera together or whatever, and that both of them talked about how the process, they got smarter as a result. It actually helped them refine their own thinking. And that's the kind of thing, if there hadn't been a foundation of respect and civility, they never would have been able to accomplish. So I just admire it. It just shows that no one's asking you to renounce your principles or to take on a different political philosophy. But civility is more, it's the how you go about the inevitable interactions, some of which you're going to oppose. Like, it's the old idea of you learn how to disagree without being disagreeable. There's nothing, if you will, particularly profound about it. But at the end of the day, policy is made by people. And what civility is a way of keeping open those relationships. And one of the groups I talk about in the book is the importance, say, of religious authorities. Now, I'm not telling anyone to compromise or jettison this or that position on this or that issue. Obviously, a lot of issues, say abortion, are deeply felt. But there's got to be things like nonviolence. There's got to be issues like civility. If there's any chance of reaching a commonly accepted outcome that won't lead to violence or rip states or countries apart. I think civility is just, again, it has nothing to do with your outcome. It's how you go about seeking it.
Well, you picked a wonderful example from our perspective when you highlighted the friendship of Justices Ginsburg and Scalia. And I hope you'll come visit us when you're in town here and our headquarters at the Supreme Court Historical Society, because we're being given by our chairman, who commissioned to have busts sculpted by a well-known sculptor of Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, which we're going to sit side by side in our reception area, just as an example of exactly what you're talking about. And
I think it's also just a good model for young people. The idea that just because you come out on opposite sides of something doesn't mean that somehow someone's your enemy. That you can be a strong advocate and passionate about it, yet keep open relationships and do it in a way, again, that doesn't turn everything into literally or figuratively an all or nothing, life or death kind of struggle.
Well, we're very grateful to Greg Joseph and his gift of these busts to the society, and I hope others will come visit and see that on display as well. It's an embodiment, we think, of one of your principles. Another aspect of it I wanted to ask you a little bit about today. Your comment in the book about this, civility is not censorship, and what is the importance of academic institutions to provide forum to those holding views across the political spectrum.
Yeah, and I think universities have gone too far in this, many of them. And the definition of a safe space should not be where controversial points are not voiced, but where they can be voiced safely.
Yeah.
And that's what the campus ought to be, that there should be a wide range of permitted, tolerated speech. So being civil doesn't mean, well, I'm not going to say this because it's going to hurt somebody's feelings or they may disagree. Might mean, not using certain words, or might mean, not, in my view, avoiding ad hominem attacks or, and so forth. But I think way too often in recent years, there's been a misunderstanding of what civility is. And civility is about how things are couched and so forth. It means not attacking people for their views and so forth. not attacking them, but to voice things that are controversial. If you can't do it in a university, where can you do it?
Right.
That ought to be that's one of the reasons for them. It's the place where people get exposed to things. You should be made uncomfortable. That's the whole idea of an education, to force you to rethink things, to expose you to things you didn't. If education doesn't make you uncomfortable, then you're not getting much of an education. And that has to be protected. So I worry about that too many things are silenced or shut down, or just because someone's made uncomfortable. Now, obviously, there's a question, and we're not talking about physical threat and so forth, and we've had some terrible examples in recent days, some of the spillover in the Middle East. But the idea that people are voicing very different views, this about Israel or this about Hamas, and they're arguing that out, and that ought to happen on a university campus, and hopefully people will learn some of the history. And we'll provides context for what is going on. They'll get a sense of, hopefully, an appreciation of some of the history and complexity of the issue. So I'm all in favor of people, again, not physical intimidation or threats of violence, but the idea of having a pretty wide range of views voiced. I think it's essential. That's not inconsistent with civility.
Right. Just to circle back for a moment on polarization in our country, one of in our series here on civic education, we had a discussion with Suzanne Spalding. I don't know if you're familiar with her work.
Yeah, I know Suzanne well.
Oh, good. Well, she delivered a wonderful lecture for us at the outset of this series, in which she highlighted foreign disinformation as exacerbating our differences, fueling the flames of polarization. And it's a bipartisan effort. I mean, she identified how foreign entities were seizing upon our differing opinions and then inflaming. Do you see this also as a risk, and how do we combat it?
Up to a point, but let me just sort of say, even if we were somehow able to screen all this out, we'd still have most of the problems we have.
Yeah.
So, I don't much like Russian or other bots on social media and magnifying misinformation and so forth. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that's the root cause. The real question is, why are we susceptible to it? So I'm very interested in information literacy programs that make consumers of information more critical, and it protects them, whether the source is homegrown or foreign. If it's misinformation,
right,
I don't want to see it take root. So we can try to screen out certain things, and it's come up before the court and all this about what are the obligations of those who provide the pipelines, if you will, for social media and so forth. And the lesson I take from that is there's going to be limits to constraints. Either we can't do it or we won't do certain things in terms of what's put out there. So then we have to put the emphasis on individuals and say, okay, what is good information hygiene? What are the sorts of rules? How do you recognize facts? What about multiple sources? How do you, what makes for a reputable source? So what are the questions an intelligent skeptic would ask when presented with certain information in terms of assessing its accuracy and so on? I think we could do a better job of teaching that. And that, to me, again, that to me is a real world approach, because I'm not very confident we're going to be able to screen out certain types of information.
Right, and it's hard to tell the sources as well. Another of your 10 habits is respect government service.
Sure.
And let's talk a little bit about that and your focus on that. And I'll raise another example to add to your list.
I'm glad you raised it. Look, government is incredibly important in our life. So what we want is for government to perform as well as it can. And we want the best and brightest in this country to go work in government, either for part of their lives or as a career. So if we disparage government, it seems to me we discourage people from making this this kind of a commitment, this kind of choice, and it's self-defeating because again, government makes a difference. The question is it going to make a more positive or more negative difference? So yeah, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of phrases like the deep state and all that. I don't believe in that. Most of the people I've met in government are like people I met outside of government. They're working hard. They're doing what they do for. Sure, some are better than others, but that's true again of any sector of life. But what we want to do is raise government performance, and we want to. One way to do it is to attract real talent. Another is how we structure what goes on in government. And there's a lot of lessons. You know, I used to teach at a school of government, so I have some familiarity with that. But I think it's really self-defeating for a country to disparage public. And what I want to do is encourage it because I think people might find it really good. It's a great training mechanism. It's a great way to complement or supplement training you would get from other sources. It's also a great way to bring Americans together. I think one of the problems we have as a society is increasingly we're too separate. We don't have enough common experience. You know, one of the good things, you know, a lot of people wrote about the greatest generation and all that Tom Brokaw and others about the draft, World War II.
Yeah.
In other words, where it brought people together, this person from rural America, this person from urban, this person of this color or religion, and they would have relationships that normally they would never have. And that is one of, this is a country that's founded on a collectivism of Americanness.
Yeah.
And so public service is a way to do that. I'm not suggesting a draft. I understand all the resistance to that. But I like the fact that we're beginning to see public service programs introduced by several states. We're beginning to see, new public service programs introduced at the federal level. So I think it's a great way to bring Americans of disparate backgrounds together. And again, to build on what is either happening or not happening in our schools or so forth. So these people, so hopefully they've given something back, they've gotten something for it. And then when they go on to do something else, they bring greater capacity to it. So, and it reduces some of their suspicion because they would say, wow, I did this program, it was paid for by public money. And you know what? It was pretty good. Yeah. Governments can do good things. I enjoyed it. You know, so I met this guy and doing it. So I want to encourage it. And again, I have a goal where I want this government to perform. Democracies need to deliver, or people get disillusioned with democracy. So we want and need our government to be effective.
Well, it's a very important point, I think, you make in your book. And I did an interview recently with Justice Breyer and his brother, Judge Breyer, Chuck Breyer from San Francisco. And both of them, in the context of government service, spoke about how their military experience, and not many people know that, is in both of their backgrounds, opened their eyes to how others in the United States who were less fortunate than they were lived and how they grew up. And it expanded their viewpoints enormously. And they both spoke very fondly and highly of their service in the military. But it goes to your point about expanding experiences.
Yeah, and the limits given modern militaries in terms of manpower needs and the rest. So that's why all these civilian opportunities, and it could be overseas, it could be here at home. God knows we have a lot of sectors of our society that call out for assistance and help. And so whether it's in the range of, it could be education, climate, infrastructure development, you name it. I think there's, enormous opportunities. And there's funding constraints. I get that. But again, I think the side effects of public service, bringing people together, breaking down some barriers or suspicions about government, are really healthy.
Great. I have one other question, and then we have a series of questions that we're getting from our audience, which is great to get their involvement as well, which I'll turn to in a moment. But just to wrap up on my questions, supporting the teaching of civics, what do you think is the most effective strategy? You mentioned this throughout, I think, your remarks, but passing down the essentials of what it means to be an American and what the strategy is for that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I wrestle with it myself. As I said before, I'd love in principle for this to be done at the national level. I don't think that's politically realistic. So almost, if I may quote another justice of the court, Mr. Brandeis, I think states are going to have to be the laboratories of democracy. In this case, the laboratories of civics education, and introduce it that way. And also universities, and we're seeing it happen. So I think we need to develop programs and try them out and see what happens. And I think it could be, we could talk about what exposure to some of the great literature of American political history. Talk about the history and how does one deal with controversies about history. I think there needs to be an information literacy component of this, but I'm working on this question. Indeed, one of the follow-on projects I have to this book, the Bill of Obligations, is I'm beginning to think very hard about what would be useful. And I've been working with certain governors and certain university presidents about what they put in the classroom and what kind of readings, what kind of simulations, and so forth. Because one of the things I like about simulations, mock Supreme Court sessions, or mock constitutional convention, or model Congress, is you can model in these things, you can introduce a lot of the obligations. Things like compromise, things like civility. So I like simulations that both teach necessary content, but also encourage the absorption of some of the obligations of good citizenship. So you asked a question that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm trying to develop, working with various, again, people in the political world, people in the educational world, what might be some useful approaches.
Well, I would love to work with you on that. And I want to make a plug for something we're doing. We've initiated a program we call the Supreme Court in My Hometown. And we're going around the country, sort of a blend of what you've suggested, to do it at the local level, state and local level, in addition to the federal level. But we're identifying cases that originated in hometowns of around the country, and we're going to federal courthouses and bringing high school students in to learn about cases that originated in their hometowns that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. So they get to see the court and how it operates and its decision making from a local lens, and it kind of brings the Supreme Court down to earth, if you will, into their classrooms and locales.
No, I love that. The other thing, one thing I also recommend, since we're talking about the court, is I say for Americans, one of the great treats for me was to sit in on oral arguments.
Yeah.
Just what an experience. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but just to be part of that and to watch the give and take is it just somehow, to me, it was a wonderful example of democracy in action. And so I just there's often long lines outside the court building when there's a big controversial case to be discussed. But I just love the idea that Americans would get to see that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that, Richard. We have some questions from the audience. I'll just read through them. Just quoting from them, this is quite thought-provoking and inspiring. I would ask this question: legislation is often passed after debate and compromise, then challenges are mounted based on what are often viewed as specious constitutional grounds in order to defeat the important compromises that resulted in the passage of law. How do we explain to those whose views were thus nullified that their civility and compromise were worth it? So I take it in the context of courts interpreting laws that were passed.
This gets me a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I think it's one of the areas that courts then have to be careful. It makes a certain case for restraint. And indeed, I think the whole bias of the courts is to, correct me if I'm wrong here, is to give great scope, if you will, to the political process. I mean, what you see are the courts often restricting their role, saying, look, it's not up to us. That's why we have Congress, or that's why we have, the executive branch and the Congress to work these things out, or at the state level. And the courts, so I think need to be, how do I put it, be careful about being too, shall we say, interventionist there. And I think they are. So I don't see them wading in to undo too many compromises. In many ways, they push the political process to come up with a compromise. Look, at the end of the day, you've got these branches of government at the federal level. You've got a federal system, and a lot of moving parts. And it's a funny combination of showing respect for the other moving parts, at the same time adherence to principles, and not allowing the individual parts to override those principles. And there's a tension there. I get it,
Right.
but that's the stuff of politics.
Well, I think, Richard, too, it's somewhat circular. I mean, if courts weigh in on legislation that was result of compromise, that's not the end of the road. The legislatures are free to come back and revise the laws accordingly.
You make a good point. It's a really good point. And if you don't, there's usually avenues of redress, and it may be in the legal process, it may be in the political process, at the federal level, the state level. And that's I think, the real requirement is to make sure that the playing field is level. So the opportunities for redress are adequate.
Right.
But I agree with you. It's who was it? It was was it George Shultz? Or someone who once said to me about Washington, things are never over in this town. And things get visited and revisited, and it can be frustrating, but it is to some extent the stuff of politics. And one of the structural advantages and hallmarks of democracies is their ability to revisit and to reconsider. Times change, technology change, attitudes change. It's mistakes are made and then perhaps learn from. And I think that's a structural advantage of democracy.
I think that's a strength as well. Another question: should public service be obligatory after high school, prior to college?
I get nervous with obligatory, because then you get into mandates and drafts, and people will resist on principle. I think it should be high. I think it's highly desirable. I think people should be paid for it. I think economic incentives, training programs, so people say, wow, if I do this for 2 years, my skill level, the wages I'll be able to get in something else are up. Again, I think we want to make it interesting and encourage it. But no, I'm uncomfortable with mandates, because I think that then becomes the focus of debate, whether it's something every American should have to do. And I think the challenge is to make it something that most Americans want to do.
Great. We have an inquiry from someone who has written about working together to build a Chief Justice's virtual convention between U.S., Ukraine, and Russia, possibly hosted in the Vermont bar. How can we learn from your Ireland approaches to civility?
Well, the situation in Northern Ireland worked when those who were trying to advance their political agendas through terrorism or uses of politically inspired violence became persuaded that that would not succeed, that they could not shoot their way to their preferences. And then secondly, the complement to that was that there was a serious political path that was put forward. And this was done over the Thatcher and Blair administrations in the UK. And there was ultimately a change in behaviors and thinking. And I think that will be the answer for any international dispute, is right now, the governments in Ukraine and Russia are not prepared to give up what they are what they are pursuing on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. Ukraine wants the recovery of all of its territory. Russia obviously wants to control Ukraine. So the situation is not ripe for resolution, but I do think it's likely at some point it will. That at some point one or both protagonists will conclude that more of the same, that the benefits won't outweigh the cost. And that's the beginning of a situation where the dialogue could be useful. Even in the meantime, there might be a case for useful things, if only to anticipate or deal with some of the issues that are sure to arise in any future political settlement. For example, the rights and protections that would be given to minorities and so forth. That kind of interaction is, I think, tends to be beneficial. I think in the current environment, it may be difficult, to say the least. We're not quite there yet, but at some point, that'll be useful.
Oh, thank you. One last question. I may be able to help with an answer on this one. Do you have any, we might have time for 2 questions here, but do you have any thoughts or suggestions on what federal trial judges across the country can do to promote civics education in their particular localities? And I mentioned our Supreme Court in My Hometown program a few minutes ago, but I should also mention that we had, when I was the director of the administrative office of the courts, we starting to set up space in federal courthouses that was unused, libraries, for example, which gets less use these days because everybody's online doing research, but space that the public might use, bring high school students into the courts. And I gave an example of teaching about how the court system works, but in that space,
Sure.
we get volunteers to help do that. But you could expand it beyond certainly the courts and just incorporate a civic education generally.
Again, there's the ability to invite people in to see courts in action. Whatever the procedures are that'll permit
Right.
that. And then
Yeah.
you've got judges, you've got clerks, you've got all these individuals who have this experience, are potentially great mentors, or could go into classrooms. Like this, it's an important part of what makes this this democracy work. The courts have you don't need me to tell you about it, a central role. And I think for young people, it's quite possible the average teacher can't do this. The average parent can't do this. So I just think there's to almost demystify what goes on and to expose people, and to the extent people have the background to talk about some of the principles that go into making a democracy work. So I would think that the classroom opportunities would be great. Either bring the students to the courts or bring people from the courts into the classroom to the students.
Great. Last question. Parents and grandparents wanted to share this book with young people in their lives. What do you think the best age for readers are?
Okay, well, it's a fair question. I think nothing before middle school, but I think probably high school. I think it's written at a level that is aimed at high school, college. It could also be life learners, but it doesn't assume a lot of background. I write it in a way that does not assume that people are steeped in the arguments. So I try to make it as accessible as I can. There's a whole section, by the way, on further, if you want to learn more, where to go for it.
Yeah.
In the paperback edition, which comes out in early November, in a few days, there's 4 pages of questions to guide either classrooms or study groups or book clubs to talk about the ideas in the book. But it could be used at dinner tables. So I think it could be, and yeah, I love the idea, and I've had people have told me about it where they've gotten it for their kids or their grandkids, and they have them read it. And I think anyone over say high school, junior high school can manage, if not all of it, most of it, and certainly high school, college level, well within their reach. And so people shouldn't shy away from it. And again, it has lots of suggestions about where to go for more, and how to questions for parents to actually or grandparents about having those conversations with kids about the book, about the ideas in the book.
That's great. Well, Richard, thank you very, very much for joining me today for this fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed it, and we look forward to your next book. You alluded to you were working on one, so that's great, and how to implement these suggestions, and we look forward to that. The next event on the Society's virtual calendar is on November 17th at noon, when we will be hosting Cliff Sloan in conversation with Teresa Wynn Roseborough about his new book, The Court at War, FDR, His Justices, and the World They Made. Registration is now open on the Society's website at www.supremecourthistory.org. And we know that being able to reach out to all of our members all over the country and worldwide via these events has been one of the upsides of our turn to virtual lectures during the pandemic. And we're going to continue to host these events monthly and virtually post-pandemic. So we're grateful for all of those of you who have joined us today. Reminder that a survey will go out later this afternoon to respond, to get your responses to everyone who registered in advance. We hope you will respond. We want to make these programs as informative and accessible to as many people as possible. So we thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to our guest, Richard Haass. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for all you and your colleagues do there.